Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, early morning. The scene is still calm, not yet swept up in the whirlwind of reunions, farewells, and hasty departures. Suitcases roll lightly over the marble floors, the shuffle of footsteps from workers, and flights preparing to take off. But among all these moments, no one realizes that today a passenger unlike any other will board that plane. Marjgery passes through the security gate, unnoticed. She, a 16-year-old black girl, like any other young person, is preparing for a normal flight. The only difference is the ticket she holds in her hand. A first-class ticket. Not just any ticket, but one that most others would spend a lifetime dreaming of. She's no stranger to first-class flights, and today she's traveling alone. She walks with confidence, not rushing, not overly conspicuous, but every step seems to carry a silent reminder she belongs here. She wears a navy blue sweater, high-waisted beige trousers, perfect down to the smallest detail, nothing flashy, nothing ostentatious. An elegant, neat appearance, just as she was always taught from a young age to always carry herself in a way that could never be criticized. Her mother taught her, always keep yourself neat and confident and you'll never have to worry about anything, and she has adhered to those principles. As she passes through security, no one notices, and everything unfolds as it does every day. But as she approaches the boarding gate, something unexpected happens. A large, muscular, older man in a security uniform suddenly steps forward and blocks her path. All eyes in the airport seem to immediately turn toward her, but no one speaks. Only silence envelops the scene. "This is not your seat." His voice rings coldly, with no hint of gentleness. He pulls at her arm roughly, as if this were a normal act, as if she were a strange fish disrupting the space considered to be for those deserving of it. The humiliation feels like a deep wound in Marjgery's heart, but she doesn't let it break open. She doesn't shout or complain. She just stands still, looking into the eyes of those around her. Some of them glance at her, some even pull out their phones and start recording. Judgmental eyes. Whispers. "Must be a discounted ticket," a woman whispers to her husband. "There's no way she could afford a first-class ticket." Everyone looks at her like an anomaly, like an outsider, someone who doesn't belong here. But Marjgery doesn't flinch. She looks directly at them, saying nothing. Every glance, every whispered word, seems to ignite the fire within her. And in that moment she knows that these insults, these looks, are just small steps in a larger battle that she will win. She stands up from her first-class seat, a seat she knows she has every right to occupy. She doesn't run, nor does she resist. She gently smooths her coat as if to brush off the humiliation. But deep inside she has made a silent promise. No one will ever take away her respect again. The tension in the air seems to rise with every passing second as Marjgery walks forward. Each step she takes seems to carry an unquenchable fire. She walks onto the plane with calmness, holding her first-class ticket tightly in her hand, never looking back, despite the eyes that continue to follow her. There's no protest, no request to ease the situation. Only silence and the feeling of a quiet warrior preparing for a great battle. As she sits down in her first-class seat, she knows that nothing can make her back down. She is ready to face every challenge ahead, and all she needs to do is stand firm. The looks from those around her, the glances full of suspicion, cannot make her yield. Everyone has their own story, and she, like a warrior in her fight, will not allow anyone to judge her based on her skin color and social class. And as she looks at her phone, she sends a message to her beloved father. "I'm on the plane. Thank you for the ticket. Love you, Dad." She sets the phone down and looks out the window, watching the wind sweep across the sky. Everything around her continues as it always has, but Marjgery knows that the world will never be the same after she steps into it. Don't forget to like and follow so you don't miss the challenging journey Marjgery will face. What do you think she will do next? Share your thoughts in the comments. The airplane door slowly closed, marking the beginning of a long flight. Marjgery looked out the window, where the clouds began to rise high, forming a vast expanse of white. But inside this first-class cabin there was nothing peaceful. Every gaze, though unspoken, was directed at her. Every person on this flight, whether silent or not, had a question in their mind. What is this girl doing here? The feeling was like a shadow covering the space. Marjgery could sense the curiosity, the scrutiny from the passengers around her. It was a cold, judgmental gaze, full of doubt, and not even slightly concealed. They could not understand why a young black girl would be sitting in first class, a space reserved for those they considered deserving. And in that moment, Marjgery realized she was not just facing a long flight. She was up against an unspoken battle with no clear boundaries. As the plane slowly glided through the clouds, with soft waves gently hitting the plane's body, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin became heavy. Marjgery could feel the tension emanating from everyone. It was an unavoidable silence. Everything seemed suddenly too loud, even though no one had spoken. Only curious and judgmental eyes remained. She couldn't ignore them, nor could she escape the tension in the air. She sat upright, looking at the phone in her hand, acting as though nothing was happening. Her hands didn't shake. On the contrary, they held the phone with absolute calm. One hand lightly pressed the screen, sending a quick message to her beloved father. "I've boarded. Thanks for the ticket. Love you." The simple message contained resilience. She wanted her father to know that nothing and no one would make her bend. At that moment, a man in a gray suit, sitting opposite her, began to lean toward her. His eyes briefly passed over her, then returned to the screen of his tablet. A strange sensation started creeping into Marjgery, as if he was evaluating her from head to toe. He looked at her not out of curiosity, but out of scrutiny. She couldn't help but feel the disdain in his gaze. It wasn't just a look from a stranger. It was a look from someone who silently assumed she shouldn't be here. Marjgery sighed, then turned back to look out the window. She didn't rush or avoid the gaze, but instead she felt a strange clarity. She understood that these people weren't just judging her. They were judging an entire system. A system that had taught them that only people like them deserved to be in these spaces, spaces called first class. A soft voice rose from the back of the cabin, pulling Marjgery from her thoughts. A woman stood up, pointed at her, and whispered to the flight attendant, "She must be in the wrong seat. No way a young black girl should be sitting here." The flight attendant looked toward Marjgery, her eyes revealing undisguised doubt. She asked Marjgery a simple but scrutinizing question. "Can I see your ticket, please?" Marjgery looked directly into her eyes, then calmly took out her ticket and handed it to the attendant. The tension in the air seemed to condense, every gaze turning toward her, while she stood still, calm, as if there was nothing to worry about. A silence enveloped the entire cabin. The curious and doubtful looks from the passengers around her couldn't shake her. She knew she wasn't just fighting for a seat on this plane. She was fighting for something bigger, for the right to be respected, for the human dignity she deserved. The attendant returned the ticket to her, her eyes now lacking any doubt, though still carrying an unmistakable reluctance. Marjgery simply smiled softly, then turned back to look out the window, where thick clouds passed by, blocking her view. No one spoke, but the atmosphere in the cabin became stifling. All the eyes around her silently followed her every movement. Whispers continued to spread, and the glances still wouldn't leave her. But Marjgery didn't care. She had learned to live with these prejudices, to face them without letting them break her. And today she wasn't just an ordinary girl. She was a warrior, ready to change a system that had existed for far too long in injustice. The painful feelings of discrimination, of what she had to endure, no longer mattered. These people, These looks, they were all just expressions of fear. Fear of something they couldn't understand, that a girl like her not only deserved to sit here, but could also make everything they believed to be true crumble. The coldness of the airplane cabin had become denser than ever. With every passing minute, Marjorie felt the tension in the air like a taut string, threatening to snap at any moment. The looks, the scrutinizing glances, continued to be directed at her, but she didn't move, not once turning her head. She knew well that these people weren't seeing her. They were seeing a representation of everything they had been taught was undeserving. They saw a young black girl sitting in first class, someone who shouldn't be here. But no one understood that her mere presence was a quiet defiance against the deep-seated prejudices embedded in this society. Marjorie continued to text her father, each word typed on her phone light and composed, as if it were her way of maintaining calm in the suffocating cabin. She could feel the tension from everyone around her, but her heart remained steady, unwavering. She knew that what she was doing wasn't just a personal act. It was a message that went further. We deserve respect, without discrimination, without degradation. But these people wouldn't easily accept that. The whispers from the passengers around her, the glances filled with curiosity, could not shake her. But when a man stood from behind and walked toward her, she couldn't ignore the change in the atmosphere. The way he looked at her was no longer curiosity, but a clear threat. "Do you have this first-class ticket?" he asked, his tone no longer one of mere doubt, but of judgment, as if he were accusing her. The flight attendant, who had previously smiled politely, now seemed uncertain. She glanced at the ticket, then at Marjorie, at the man, clearly feeling uncomfortable. She quietly nodded, but her eyes couldn't hide her confusion. Each question from the passengers, each sharp look felt like daggers, trying to humiliate Marjorie in front of everyone. But she didn't let their gazes make her waver. The silence and tension between the passengers grew even more apparent. She could feel each of their eyes on her, as if they were waiting to see what she would do next, as if they wanted her to rebel or prove that she didn't belong here. But Marjorie sat up straight, phone in hand, and continued texting her father. "They won't understand, Dad, but I won't give up." Now the looks were no longer mere curiosity, they were threats. They had started to realize that she wasn't a girl easily subdued. They didn't know that behind her calm exterior, Marjorie was a person of great resolve, with inner strength. She wasn't just a girl sitting in first class because of money or privilege. She was there because she had worked hard, sacrificed, and above all, because she deserved to be there. The tension in the cabin kept building. Every look, every whispered word was like an undercurrent brushing against her. Marjorie didn't need to respond, didn't need to speak up. She simply sat still, her gaze no longer seeking validation from those around her. She knew that in this battle no one but herself could help her. Suddenly, an announcement broke through the tense atmosphere in the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin preparations for the next phase of the flight." But this did nothing to alleviate the stifling feeling in the air. Marjorie turned back to look at the passengers around her, those who had yet to let her go, still whispering and gossiping. But she didn't care anymore. She was no longer afraid. She had long overcome her fear. With unwavering determination, Marjorie stood up, placed her phone down, and walked toward the restroom. The passengers' eyes still followed her, but she didn't turn back. Each step she took was like a powerful declaration. She moved in silence, but it was a silence filled with authority, and it seemed as though the entire atmosphere of the cabin had shifted by the sheer force of her determination. She returned to her seat, quietly sitting down. The tension still loomed, but now Marjorie no longer felt the oppression she'd felt before. She knew that when all of this ended, not only would she have won, but those around her would realize that these prejudices could no longer exist. She had started this fight, and she would be the one to win. The airplane cabin was as silent as a wall of ice, with every second seeming to stretch longer than usual. Marjgery sat still in her seat, gripping the edge of her chair. She could feel the tension in the air, but it wasn't fear. No, she wasn't afraid. She could only feel one thing. The moment when the passengers on this flight would realize that their glances, their judgments, and their prejudice couldn't erase the truth. She deserved to be here. People continued to whisper, their occasional glances sliding past her, but no one dared speak directly. They knew she wasn't someone easily subdued. The feeling was like an undercurrent rising, and she was a part of it, steady, resolute. After a while, the light in the cabin shifted, as if the space was preparing for a confrontation. The man in the gray suit sitting across from her stood up again, his eyes still fixed firmly on Marjgery. He wasn't the only one. A few other passengers also started to rise, and Marjgery could sense the movement, as if something was happening in the shadows that she couldn't yet fully understand. As the man walked closer, she could feel every step he took, each heavy footstep seemingly made to draw attention. He no longer hid his contempt. "Do you even know where you're sitting?" he asked, his tone no longer one of mere suspicion, but full of challenge. Marjgery looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I know," she replied, her voice calm, her gaze sharp as a knife. "I deserve to be here, and I will stay here until I choose to leave." He stood still, his eyes betraying a hint of surprise, as if he never expected a girl like Marjgery to respond with such resilience. A moment of silence stretched out, and no one dared to say anything more. Everyone in the cabin watched them, as if afraid to look away from the confrontation unfolding. But Marjgery didn't need to prove anything further. She didn't need to continue this conversation with him because in her heart she had already found her answer. She glanced around, her eyes still fixed on her, and she could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change only she could perceive. She had known this for a long time, only she could change everything. At that moment, a flight attendant approached, her face showing no surprise, as if she already knew what was happening. She didn't look at Marjgery, but at the man in the gray suit. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked, her tone gentle, but carrying a firmness no one had noticed before. The man hesitated, his eyes still fixed on Marjgery. But then he shook his head and returned to his seat. "Let her sit," he said, but his voice no longer carried the confidence it once did. Marjgery remained seated, unchanged. The tense moments had passed, but she could sense that this battle was not a victory in a single moment. It would continue, and she, with all her patience, would lead this fight to its end. As the flight continued, Marjgery no longer looked toward the passengers around her. She didn't need to. The eyes that once judged her were now just small spots against the vast sky. She knew she would be the one to change these prejudices. And as she sat up straight, her eyes fixed on the window, she told herself, "Nothing can make me fall." The flight wasn't just a physical journey. It was a journey of the spirit. Marjgery had remained steadfast in her fight. And each step she took was progress in this battle. What she was doing wasn't just for herself. It was for all those who had been judged, discriminated against, and overlooked simply because they didn't belong somewhere. In the cabin, the passengers continued to talk, but Marjgery was no longer a part of that conversation. She was no longer the object of judgment. She was the one who decided. She was the one in control, and she wouldn't let anyone among them determine her worth anymore. This was just the beginning. The silence in the airplane cabin felt like an invisible restraint pressing down on every passenger. But for Marjgery, it was not suffocating. It was an opportunity to prove that she deserved to be here. She had stood firm against all the scrutinizing glances, the whispered words, but now she realized that this was just a small part of a much larger battle she had to face. Hours passed, and the flight slowly glided over mist-covered mountain ranges. The white clouds floated beneath her, like a serene landscape enveloping the entire space. Marjorie no longer thought much about the glances, the whispers, or the small conversations within the cabin. She focused solely on one thing. Where would this fight of hers go? But she didn't expect that just as she felt most confident, as though she had overcome all obstacles, a shock would come her way, altering everything. As she was resting with her eyes closed, a voice from behind broke the silence, not with a greeting, but with a question full of doubt. "Are you the one with the first-class ticket?" The voice cut through the stillness, and Marjorie immediately felt a wave of anger rise within her. A man, not the first to criticize her, but this time he seemed to be deliberately trying to pull her out of the space she had courageously claimed. She slowly opened her eyes and faced the man standing there, looking at her with an expression full of suspicion. He was no longer just another passenger. He was a symbol of the judgments trying to diminish her worth. Someone she couldn't ignore, someone she couldn't simply avoid. He continued, not giving her a chance to respond. "Your first-class ticket doesn't match your appearance. Can you explain why you're sitting here?" His words weren't just a judgment. They were an attack on Marjorie's very dignity. Once again, all eyes in the cabin turned to her. Those who had been silent now began to lose their patience. Some started to smile, while others whispered among themselves, as if waiting for Marjgery to falter, to step back. But Marjgery was no longer the easily subdued girl she had once been. She was ready. She stood up, her eyes lighting up with a fire that could not be extinguished. She wasn't standing up just for herself. She was standing up for everyone who had been treated unjustly, for all those who had to endure society's judgment simply because they didn't fit the standards it had imposed. She didn't speak right away. She slowly walked toward the man, not rushing, not hurried. Every step she took was a statement that she would not back down in the face of any form of discrimination. Finally, she stood face to face with him, her voice steady and cold. "I don't need to explain anything to you. My first-class ticket is not a coincidence, and I deserve to be here. If you have a problem with that, I'm sorry, but that's your issue, not mine." The man's expression seemed to freeze, like he had been doused with cold water. He fell silent, not saying another word. The passengers around them, who had just witnessed this confrontation, were also silent. Some turned away, while others seemed ashamed, realizing they had been silent witnesses to this injustice without speaking up. Marjorie returned to her seat, not looking back at the man or the eyes around her. She sat down, took a deep breath, and silently told herself, "This fight has just begun." The flight continued, but inside the cabin, everything had changed. The atmosphere was no longer as tense as before. The people around her, though not directly speaking, were starting to sense that Marjorie wasn't someone who could be easily dismissed. She had created a moment that none of them would forget. Marjorie didn't need to prove anything more. Her actions, her words, had already shown that she would never let this injustice win. And so, as the airplane glided through the white clouds, as every sound in the cabin seemed to fade, Marjorie realized that this fight was not just hers, but of everyone who had been disregarded by society. She was the symbol of resilience, of reclaiming justice in a world where sometimes only silence can triumph. The silence in the airplane cabin felt like an invisible shackle, weighing down on every passenger. But for Marjorie, it wasn't suffocating. It was an opportunity to prove that she deserved to be here. She had stood firm against every scrutinizing gaze, every whispered word. But now she realized that this was only a small part of a much larger battle she had to face. Hours passed, and the flight slowly glided over misty mountain ranges. The white clouds floated below her, like a peaceful scene covering the entire space. Marjorie no longer thought much about the glances, the whispers, or the small conversations within the cabin. She focused solely on one thing. Where would this battle of hers lead? But she didn't expect that, just when she felt most confident, as though she had overcome all obstacles, a shock would come her way, altering everything. As she rested with her eyes closed, a voice from behind broke the silence, not with a greeting, but with a question full of doubt. "Are you the one with the first-class ticket?" The voice pierced through the stillness, and Marjorie immediately felt a wave of anger rise within her. A man, not the first to criticize her, but this time, he seemed to be deliberately trying to pull her out of the space she had bravely claimed. She slowly opened her eyes and faced the man standing there, looking at her with suspicion. He was no longer just another passenger. He was a symbol of the judgments trying to diminish her worth, someone she couldn't ignore, someone she couldn't simply avoid. He continued, not giving her a chance to respond. "Your first-class ticket doesn't match your appearance. Can you explain why you're sitting here?" His words weren't just a judgment. They were an attack on Marjorie's very dignity. Once again, all eyes in the cabin turned to her. Those who had been silent now began to lose their patience. Some started to smile, while others whispered among themselves as if waiting for Marjorie to falter, to step back. But Marjorie was no longer the easily subdued girl she had once been. She was ready. She stood up, her eyes lighting up with a fire that could not be extinguished. She wasn't standing up just for herself. She was standing up for everyone who had been treated unjustly, for all those who had to endure society's judgment simply because they didn't fit the standards it had imposed. She didn't speak right away. She slowly walked toward the man, not rushing, not hurried. Every step she took was a statement that she would not back down in the face of any form of discrimination. Finally, she stood face to face with him, her voice steady and cold. "I don't need to explain anything to you. My first-class ticket is not a coincidence, and I deserve to be here. If you have a problem with that, I'm sorry, but that's your issue, not mine." The man's expression seemed to freeze, like he had been doused with cold water. He fell silent, not saying another word. The passengers around them, who had just witnessed this confrontation, were also silent. Some turned away, while others seemed ashamed, realizing they had been silent witnesses to this injustice without speaking up. Marjorie returned to her seat, not looking back at the man or the eyes around her. She sat down, took a deep breath, and silently told herself, "This fight has just begun." The flight continued, but inside the cabin everything had changed. The atmosphere was no longer as tense as before. The people around her, though not directly speaking, were starting to sense that Marjorie wasn't someone who could be easily dismissed. She had created a moment that none of them would forget. Marjorie didn't need to prove anything more. Her actions, her words, had already shown that she would never let this injustice win. And so, as the airplane glided through the white clouds, as every sound in the cabin seemed to fade, Marjorie realized that this fight was not just hers, but of everyone who had been disregarded by society. She was the symbol of resilience, of reclaiming justice in a world where sometimes only silence can triumph. As the airplane began its descent, a heavy feeling like a dark cloud enveloped the air in the first-class cabin. Marjorie could feel the tension from the passengers around her. They no longer looked at her with curiosity or judgment as they had before. Now they regarded her with a silent acknowledgement. They knew that she was someone who had a right to stand her ground in this cabin, not because of the first-class ticket she held, but because of the dignity she carried with her. Marjorie didn't feel any pleasure from their gazes. She didn't need their empathy, nor did she need them to validate her worth. What she had done, what she had endured, was not for their recognition. She was doing this for herself, for those who could not speak up, for those still buried in the darkness of discrimination. She had embarked on a fight that not everyone was willing to join. The silence blanketing the space grew even more intense. The passengers around her started to sit back, preparing for the end of the flight. But for Marjorie, this journey had never been about reaching a destination. It was just a stop on a much larger journey she had chosen for herself. It was the journey of someone who would never yield, someone who would never accept discrimination or oppression in any form. Suddenly, a phone rang in the cabin. The space was immediately torn apart by the sound of the ringtone. Marjgery didn't pay attention to it at first, but when she looked up, she saw the gaze of other passengers directed at a man sitting toward the front. This man, an airline executive, was staring intently at his phone as though something serious was unfolding. A little later, as the chatter around her started to fade, Margery could sense a new wave of tension in the air. An urgent call from outside, a decision that no one in the cabin could understand. But she began to realize change was near. It was no longer just about a young girl on a flight. It was about everything she had endured, the fight she had started, and now, this battle was drawing the attention of much greater forces. Margery didn't need to say anything more. She watched the airline executive as he received an urgent message from the operations team. She couldn't hear his words, but she could see the change in his face. She knew that what was happening outside the cabin, the decisions being made, had a direct impact on her, and nothing would be the same again. When the plane touched down at Los Angeles Airport, Margery felt the change in the atmosphere, not just within the cabin, but in the entire space she was about to enter. She walked off the plane without looking back, without needing to look at the people around her. She didn't need to keep facing their stares anymore. Her journey wasn't over here. It had only just begun. She felt something strange in her heart, not worry, but an unshakable determination. She had done this. She had awakened an entire system, an empire with everything she had. She would not stop. No longer the girl sitting in first class for the validation of others, she'd become a symbol of the fight against discrimination, of what happens when a person refuses to yield. And as she walked through the airport doors, Margery realized this fight wasn't just her own. It was for everyone who had been marginalized and oppressed by society. It was a fight that would never end, and she would be the one to lead it, not just in this fight, but in all the battles to come. The flight had landed, but for Margery it was just the beginning of a new journey. As Margery stepped out of the airport, no one could see the profound transformation within her. But for those who had stood alongside her on the flight, those haunting gazes would never be forgotten. This wasn't the end of that flight. Her fight wasn't just with the passengers in the cabin. It was a real struggle to change a system that upheld racism, discrimination, and the degradation of human dignity. The feeling of freedom that enveloped her as she walked out of the airport was the moment she knew she had awakened a great storm, and that storm was beginning to spread. Though her journey had just begun, what she had already done could not be undone. She had made a mark, a scar that no one could erase. A few days later, Margery received the call she had been waiting for. She stood in her office, phone in hand, listening to the voice on the other end. "We've received the lawsuit. It's been accepted. You're about to face a tough legal battle, but we will see this through," the voice on the phone said firmly, but with underlying concern. Margery didn't answer right away. She sat down in the chair across from her desk, gazing out the window where the light was fading as the evening descended. She had prepared for this moment for a long time, but now facing the reality, a strange feeling crept into her heart. It wasn't worry, but a deep sense of resolve, a challenge she had longed for. The next day, as Margery walked into the courtroom, everything felt different. She was no longer just a young black girl, discriminated against on a flight. She'd become a symbol for the countless unnamed battles, for the quiet changes that society could no longer ignore. The courtroom was packed, and Margery could feel the eyes of everyone, those beside her and those across from her. Each look weighed with a single question: where will she go from here? What will she do to change this system? But Margery wasn't afraid. She wasn't just facing airline staff. She was facing powerful forces within the aviation industry, those who had defended an outdated and discriminatory system. She stood tall, knowing that no matter how many adversaries stood before her, she would not back down. The trial began. The testimony from the other side was filled with denial, excuses to justify their actions. They tried to defend the discrimination they had created, claiming that the actions of the flight attendants and security staff were merely misunderstandings, part of normal security procedures. But none of their words could shake Marjgery. She had heard enough meaningless explanations throughout her life. When it was her turn to speak, there was no tremor in her voice. She spoke with calm strength, as if she weren't just representing herself, but all those who had endured this discrimination. Your actions weren't misunderstandings. They were racist. You relied on the prejudices deeply embedded in the society, and you didn't see me as a person worthy of being there, even though I had a valid ticket, even though I had the right to board. I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for all those who've been disrespected, degraded, simply because they didn't fit what you consider worthy. Her words echoed through the courtroom like a declaration of war against all those who continued to defend the discriminatory system that had existed for too long. Marjgery didn't raise her voice, didn't need to shout to express her outrage. She simply spoke the truth. And that was something no one could deny. The legal battle stretched on for weeks, and each court session was another confrontation with large airline companies, high-paid lawyers, and powerful people in the industry. But every time Marjgery stood before the court, she didn't just stand strong for herself. She stood for everyone who had lived in the shadow of discrimination. Finally, when the verdict was announced, no one could believe the outcome. An entire empire had to bow down to the determination of a young girl. The airline she had sued was ordered to pay a huge compensation, but that wasn't what made Marjgery happy. What she wanted, what she needed, was a public apology and changes in the airline's recruitment and training policies. As Marjgery walked out of the courthouse, she felt she had won not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced and endured. She hadn't just won the lawsuit. She had defeated the system that had suppressed people like her for so long. That night, after the trial was over, as she sat alone in her office, an unexpected text arrived. It was from her father. "You did great. You're our pride." Marjgery smiled softly. She knew that this was just the beginning of a much longer battle, but in that moment she felt the power of silence, of resilience, and of justice prevailing. As Marjgery stepped out of the courthouse, the air outside felt like a storm was approaching. Journalists, cameras, and crowds had gathered, all eager to capture this moment, when a young girl not only defeated a system of racial discrimination, but also made an entire powerful industry rethink itself. Every eye was on her, but Marjgery didn't feel tired or proud. She felt a change within herself, not a personal victory, but a victory for all those who had been discriminated against, ignored simply because of their skin color, gender, or background. A reporter approached, camera in hand, but Marjgery didn't rush to respond. She had grown tired of the meaningless questions, the ones she had already answered long ago with her actions. She didn't need their sympathy anymore. She knew that what she did wasn't for recognition or praise. It was to bring about real change. Change begins with the smallest of actions, with standing firm against the prejudices she faced every day. "Can you tell us how you feel now that you've won this lawsuit?" a reporter asked. Marjgery looked directly into the camera, her gaze unwavering. "My feeling is simple. I'm proud to have fought for justice, but this victory isn't just for me. It's for all those who've been discriminated against, for those who have no voice, and I won't stop here. This fight is far from over, but today, we've won an important victory." As the reporter continued asking endless questions, Marjgery knew she would never let herself be dragged into this meaningless conversation. She walked away, not in a hurry, but steadily, with a clear goal in mind. After leaving the crowd, Marjgery felt as though she was stepping into a different space, one where there was no discrimination, no subtle oppression that she had endured for so long. She was no longer the girl sitting quietly in first class, deemed unworthy. She had become the symbol of the fight against racism, and she knew that this battle would continue. When she got home, her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Messages, calls, and notifications from civil rights organizations, support groups, and even strangers urged her to continue the fight. Some said she should continue leveraging the attention to create real change. All the messages had one common thread. They wanted her to keep leading the charge in this battle. But Marjgery wasn't easily swayed by those soothing words. She knew that real change didn't come just from winning a lawsuit. It came from concrete actions, from the conversations she would have to lead. This fight wasn't just about courts or laws. It was about the battles fought in each community, each family, and in the heart of every person. Marjgery decided to hold a meeting with those who shared her ideals, those who had stood by her throughout her journey. She knew that no one could fight this battle alone. Her allies, those who had been discriminated against and trampled upon, were the warriors she needed for the upcoming fights. At the meeting, she stood before a group of people, all of whom had been fighting for their rights. She spoke about her journey, about what she'd endured, and why this fight must continue. We can't let this discrimination continue. They beat us once, but we won't let it happen again. We won't stop until everyone realizes that this discrimination is wrong. No one has the right to decide who deserves to sit where. Every one of us deserves the rights and respect that we are entitled to. The people at the meeting listened in silence, but their gazes were not just filled with sympathy. They were gazes of determination, from those who knew they had together made a monumental change. When the meeting ended, Marjgery knew the fight was far from over. She had started a revolution, but this revolution didn't have one sole leader. Each person in the room, each person weighed down by prejudice and discrimination, would become the one to change things. And she, with everything she had done, would lead this struggle to its final victory. The people around her, those who had stood by her, were now ready. They were no longer the ones being looked down upon. They were the warriors in this fight. She had instilled in them the power of resilience, of resistance, and most importantly, she had shown them that when they stand up, they can change an entire system that has existed for far too long. And so as Marjgery continued to walk, she didn't feel tired. Because she knew that, though the road ahead was long, every step she took led to change. She was no longer a victim of discrimination. She was a winner, someone who was changing the world. The struggle would never end, but she would lead it until every person was respected, until no one had to endure the judgmental gazes and discrimination any longer. After everything that had happened, Marjgery was no longer the girl that society had once criticized, no longer someone others thought didn't deserve a seat in first class. She had become a symbol. But she understood that becoming a symbol was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a much greater mission. Her journey had only just begun, and it would continue until everyone, regardless of race or class, could live in respect and fairness. The next day after the meeting, Marjgery received an invitation to attend a national conference on equality and human rights, where civil rights leaders, international organizations, and justice advocates would gather. This was her chance to share her story with those who had the power to change society's course, but it was also a major challenge because she knew this fight wasn't just her own. It was the story of millions of people who had been forgotten by society, deprived of their rights simply because they didn't fit the majority. As Marjgery stood before the crowd, the lights on the stage illuminating her, a strange sense of peace filled her soul. She didn't feel fear. She only felt an unwavering resolve. This journey is not just mine. It belongs to all those who have been pushed aside by this system, she began, her voice calm but decisive. She looked around at the faces in the room, their expressions thoughtful and full of hope. Each of them had stood up, and each had their own story. We cannot wait for change from those in power, from those who built this system. We must change it ourselves. And change begins with the smallest actions, with standing up and saying, "We deserve to be treated with respect." She didn't need to say anything more. Her words were a statement for all those who had endured discrimination. And after those words, Marjgery knew she had accomplished a major part of the fight. She was no longer just a girl sitting in first class, no longer just a person facing racism. She had become the leader, the one who sparked a wave of change. At the conference, Marjgery not only received applause from the attendees, but was warmly welcomed by international organizations fighting for minority rights and professionals in the human rights legal field. A host of organizations and individuals expressed their support and committed to standing with her in the next stages of the journey. But what pleased Marjgery most was seeing ordinary people, those who had once been oppressed, no longer resigned, living in the shadow of discrimination. She saw them stand up, looking directly at those who had once trampled on them, and with newfound confidence they began to fight too. The world had changed, at least in her eyes. Marjgery realized that every victory, whether large or small, was the result of an ongoing process. And those standing with her, those who had fought beside her, would be the next warriors, continuing to do what was needed to create a more just world. But she also knew that her journey didn't end here. Change wouldn't come from just one decision or one lawsuit. Real change would come when people in this society realized that no one deserves to be discriminated against. No one deserves to be belittled simply because they are different, and Marjgery wouldn't stop until that became a reality. She looked toward the future and told herself, this fight isn't over. It's just begun. And Marjgery, the girl once overlooked, was now not just a symbol of resilience and change, but an indispensable part of the social revolution. A revolution she firmly believed would one day bring justice to all. Marjgery walked on, not looking back, for she had left a mark that could never fade. This fight, whether long or short, whether a victory or a loss, would always be remembered as a testament to the power of one person who dared to stand up, dared to confront those who had oppressed her. And so, with every step she took, Marjgery knew she would never stop. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all those who were still cast aside by society. She was the symbol of change, and that change would never stop. Message of the story. Marjgery's story is a courageous and resilient journey that demonstrates that every individual, no matter how marginalized by society, has the right to stand up and demand their rights, respect, and fairness. Despite facing numerous difficulties and challenges, it is only when we refuse to yield that we can create meaningful change. Marjgery fought not only for herself, but also for all those who have been discriminated against, devalued, and trampled upon in the long pursuit of equality. The story emphasizes that the fight for justice is not just about personal battles, but about comprehensive changes within society. Individual actions may not create immediate change, but they lay the foundation for a fairer system in the future. And even when facing powerful adversaries, only determination and self-belief can help us overcome and triumph. Real-life lessons, resilience and self-respect, cannot be taken away. Marjgery learned how to stand firm against prejudice, judgment, and discrimination. No matter how harsh the circumstances, only by maintaining our self-respect and determination can we overcome challenges. The important thing is never to abandon our dignity and self-worth. The fight is not just for one person. When facing injustice, we are not fighting alone. Every person who faces discrimination has the right and responsibility to stand up for themselves and others. When one person dares to speak out, they can become the spark that ignites change within the community. Change comes from action, not words. The story shows that words alone cannot change a system. Only action can make a difference. Marjgery didn't just talk. She took action by filing a lawsuit, organizing meetings, and standing up publicly against discrimination. Truly acting, even in small ways, can cause massive change. No change is easy, but it is always worth fighting for. Major changes encounter major challenges. Changing a system that has existed for so long requires sacrifice, patience, and sometimes pain. But only by accepting and facing these difficulties can we create a real difference. Justice and respect are everyone's rights. Marjgery proved that discrimination and prejudice are not just wrong. They violate basic human rights. Every individual, no matter who they are, deserves to be treated with respect and fairness. When we understand this, we will find the courage to stand up for our rights and others. The greatest lesson from Marjgery's story. Be steadfast and never give up the fight against injustice, for every action, no matter how small, can create significant change for an entire community and society. If you feel inspired by this story, don't hesitate to share it with your friends and family. Let's start conversations about fairness and respect. Take action today, even if it's just a small act, to help change the world in your way. Share, comment, and join this fight so we can all live in a more just society.